Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri and welcome to another illustration video tutorial. Now for this week's tutorial I'm drawing a transformer inspired piece. So it's a heavily robotic character design which is based off some mechanical objects or machinery. Now as I was working on this piece, I was looking at a lot of reference material on different type of vehicles, how other people approached the same subject matter or a very similar subject matter to create my own interpretation of this. Now, as you can see, I am starting off with the rough design element, so I'm just using the flat brush once again. I seem to like that brush, so I might stick with this one for a little bit longer. And I'm just roughing it out really quickly just to figure out how I'm going to go about rendering this piece. And I do spend actually quite a bit of time on this just to get additional detail elements to make sure that I have enough information for when I actually fully flesh out the rest of the character design. So this entire process actually took longer than it normally takes because it wasn't done as quickly. I did need to include a lot more information and I had to take into account a lot more structure elements. So it actually took about 2 hours just to do this. Now, this entire drawing took about 7 hours to complete. So this was an entire full day of work to draw this piece and to make it sure that it had enough detail. Now, what made this more time-consuming is the fact that it is a closer shot, so I do have to include more information, and because it's mechanical, I actually have to give a reason behind some of the mechanics. So taking all that into consideration, this increased overall time needed to complete this piece. Now, because of the complexity of this as well, I made sure to spend the most time doing everything in grayscale first. The reason why I was doing that is because in this case, it's much quicker to do everything in grayscale and just add the color afterwards. Just because of the complexity of this, it makes it a lot easier to do. Now, there are exceptions to this. If I did already have a pre-established color palette that I was sampling from, let's say I had a mechanical vehicle or something like that, and I was sampling the colors directly from that, it could have taken around roughly the same amount of time. But in this case, because I wasn't doing that, I was creating this entirely from scratch. It did take longer, but also I saved a lot of time the fact I was working in grayscale. So at this point I decided I didn't like the head design, so I removed it and started working out a new rough design for the head. I decided that making a smaller head would emphasize the bulk of this character, and I did experiment with actually adding some horns, but because this is supposed to be based more on an actual vehicle design, I decided against the horns and I ended up removing that. So the rough stages are actually nearly completed for this. I will be fleshing out some of the arm designs very quickly. As you can see, I experimented with some different types of plaque designs for his arm. I also experimented a little bit later on with some guns and turrets. I didn't like the way those design elements were working, so I gave him more of a protective gear instead. I also added some of the wheel elements to his arm in order to make it look more like he's actually from a functional vehicle as well. So I'm just working on the plated armor that's protecting his arm, as you can see, and I'm just tying that in with the other arm as well. Now the rough stages are nearly completed for this. I'm just adding some additional information, and then I will be starting out a couple different renditions and figuring out how I'll go about actually painting the rest of this. Now, I did a couple of test trial paints, so I did do some really rough stuff in the beginning stages where I was experimenting once again with the head, because the head tends to be more complex and very important for the overall drawing. I did want to make sure that it looked really good. Now, the first paint over didn't look all that great, so I removed it and I tried it a couple different times until I ended up with a design I preferred. So you will actually see me changing this to a different design very shortly. So at this point I decided to start from scratch. So I re-added the shading elements. I also moved my rough line work further back and changed opacity so that I could see some of the detail underneath, but not have it too overpowering so that it was easier to work with. By doing that, it made it a lot easier for me to work, and I was able to work a lot faster. Now for most of this drawing, I will actually keep the head fairly simplified, just because the shoulder will have more detail because it's more closer to the viewer. That and essentially the head at this point is more of a placeholder because I haven't fully fleshed out everything that I want in the head design. So I will go back and forth a bit between the different elements just to make sure everything fits. But essentially at this point, I'm still experimenting with how I'm going to actually approach the painting. Working out some of the electronic pumps and hydraulics. So I'm just using that really rough stage as a really rough mark for how I'm actually going to flesh out the rest of the character. And I actually end up using some of that element later on in the finished piece, because as objects move further away from the viewer, they require less and less detail. So keeping that in mind, there's actually certain areas that I ended up not adding any more additional details because they did not need it, because they were receding further back. And once again, because they're receding further back, I don't have to add necessarily all those details to it. So once again, this helped me save quite a bit of time because if I was fully detailing it out, it would have probably been at least a couple of extra hours just to fully flesh out everything. So this is a pretty good start for the character design at least. As you can see, I'm working on the arm now. And I keep on switching back between different parts at this stage just to make sure that they all fit together. So the reason why I worked on the head and the front of the chest area is just to make sure that all the elements end up tying together a bit more. And I'm just hinting at the information because I don't want to have too much information there because there is a lot of details in this character. I want the focus to be essentially the main focus, which is the face normally of the character. So I'm hinting at that information without actually fully fleshing it out. Working on how the gears are actually going to interlock with that wheel element. Working on the hip. And as I'm working on this, I'm essentially deciding on the fly which elements I want to have more detailed. And how I'm determining that is essentially I'm looking at the overall structure. And if I see it's a structural form that would be closer to the viewer, then I'll actually go in, I'll actually add more of that information. The couple of exceptions will be in areas where they are a general focus area because it helps show emotion in the character design. So in those areas, I will add some additional information just to make sure that it really helps bring out the character design a bit more. So because of this knee and lower leg area is not a main focal area, you're going to notice that I actually don't add too much information in there just because it's simply not needed. Because it is going to be covered actually mostly up with fog later on, I just need a hint at that information. Just working on the plated armor for his arm. I'm just adding some wires and tubing to help show how the mechanics of this character actually work. It is important to include those mechanical elements because if you don't add them, then it just doesn't make sense as an overall design. You can't understand how it actually functions, and you do need to have some form of realistic elements to make it work. Working out the claw and the rest of the hand. Now this drawing is nearly completed. You'll notice that in the further arm and leg, I actually keep the information extremely basic. Once again, it's fur in the background. I don't actually have to add it fully in there just because you won't see that information anyway. Added in some fog effects. And I've just started adding some of that color. And all I've done at this point is I've just added a simple color layer to help bring out certain portions of the plated armor that make up this character. Now, one part you won't see is that I actually add some additional shadow elements right after this painting process, just to help bring out some additional elements. If you want to have your say on what's drawn for next week's video tutorial, or have some additional questions about my drawing process, please leave a comment below. I will take the feedback you guys give me and try to answer your questions while working on next week's painting. If you want to see some of my previous works, please feel free to check out the annotations on the side of this video or visit my channel for the full playlist. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you and take care.